How often do we think about how interconnected the globe is? That industrialized and modern anthropogenic activities on one side of the planet are having devastating climate change impacts on lives, livelihoods, and habitats of communities and nations on the other side. My name is Famarake Dampha. I study coastal adaptation to climate change, specifically in the Gambia. Imagine the importance of a capital city to a nation as you imagine the importance of Washington, D.C. to the United States. Did you know that the island capital city of the Gambia, Banjul, will be underwater by 2100 if aggressive climate change mitigation and adaptation mechanisms are not put in place? Did you also know that net migration rate from Banjul has declined by 113% between 1983 to 2013? If you look at the geographic location of the Gambia on the African map, you realize that Banjul and the Gambia are not just exposed but highly vulnerable to climate change hazards, which include sea level rise and extreme precipitation. Because of those hazards, communities respond to hazards or threats in various ways. Some will stay because of lack of resources, some will modify their vulnerability and exposure levels, some will migrate, some will decide to leave. In helping us to connect the dots between migration and climate change adaptation, Robert McClemon's vulnerability formula solved for migration, in which he states, migration in the context of vulnerability is a function of exposure to a climate hazard, which could be sea level rise, sensitivity of the exposed population to that hazard, and adaptation options other than migration. It is important to emphasize that before communities or individuals resort to migration, they utilize and exhaust all adaptation mechanisms at their disposal. Often migration becomes the last solution that people venture into. However, we've also seen people who perceive threats and then they decide to migrate in order to mitigate those threats that are facing them. In fact, there are 3 times more climate migrants globally than UN-recognized refugees. This number is around 60 million people, according to the British environmentalist Norman Meyer. And the number for refugees is estimated to be around 20 million people. The estimate for climate or environmental migrants by 2050 is around 140 million to 200 million people, most of whom will be internally displaced, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. So I went to Gambia with a couple of thoughts in mind. One was to assess current residents' perception about city resilient challenges and opportunities. The second is to predict potential households' migratory response to various problems the city is currently facing with. So with the support of social science students from the University of the Gambia, we collected data based on a household survey in which we sampled 200 households in Banjul, and we had a response rate of 96%. So when I brought the data, because my response variable is a dichotomous or a binary one, which is either a yes or no willingness to migrate, so I use probit regression analysis to analyze the data and compare the results to logistic regression analysis. Of course, the results were the same. The independent variables that I included in my model range from socioeconomic variables, demographic, or what you call household indicators or household variable characteristics. And we also included variables about people's perception of institutional trust, variables around their perception of migration drivers, and variables about the importance of the city to residents as we stand as of now. The results show that a household is 33% more likely to consider migration, if it agrees that environmental or climate change factors are mainly responsible for the rapid high out migration rate in Banjul since the 80s. Second, a household is 31% more likely to consider migration if it agrees that the Gambia needs to identify a strategic location and mobilize resources to build its capital city compared to those who disagree. So if they agree that we should move to a new capital city, they are 33% more likely to consider migration as an option. Third, a household is 30% more likely to migrate if it totally disagrees that it is not worth today's investment to protect Banjul because they believe that Banjul is actually too vulnerable to be protected. They are 33% more likely to consider migration compared to those who agree. So if they disagree that we shouldn't protect Banjul, they are more likely to migrate. Fourth, a household is about 16% more likely to migrate if they agree that the government of the Gambia should be mainly responsible for the protection of the city than those who think otherwise. So if they agree that protecting the city is really government's responsibility, so in other words, they are transferring the risk to government, and they believe that if government is not doing that, then they will migrate. So for those who think that it's not really government alone, they are less likely to stay, because that makes sense, because they believe that it is sort of a mixed approach, that government and all other stakeholders should put their hands on deck in order to protect the city. Finally, very interesting result that I found very interesting was that a household is 33% more likely to consider migration if it identifies as belonging to the Mandinka ethnic group compared to their Wolof counterparts. So Mandinkas, I can strongly state that, are more likely to consider migration as an option out of Banjul than the Wolof based on our survey results. Overall, 64% of residents expressed positive willingness to migrate by 2050, with an if condition that government will provide resources to facilitate their migration process. Without government's intervention, again, more than half of the people we spoke to state positive or affirmative willingness to migrate. So whether government comes to their aid or not, over half of Banjulians are telling us that whether we are supported through a government project or not, we're thinking about leaving the city. So I can strongly say that, anchored on the new economics theory of migration, households in Banjul are utilizing migration as a risk reduction strategy for climate change adaptation. Remember that migration does not necessarily have to be forced migration. It can be perceived threat. People can migrate based on a perceived threat. So these individuals, I want to believe, because also majority of about 80% of residents in Banjul are said to be renters. Some of them are paying rent, some are not paying rent. But because of that, if their income level rises, it makes economic sense for them to buy a plot of land elsewhere, especially in newly attractive urban settlements that are spreading around the country. So the new real estate agencies are developing here. So it makes sense for these people to buy a plot of land elsewhere and become landowners and move their family outside of Banjul. Because of the congestion level also, you can also see that we have seen in our study a little bit of separation in extended family systems, where some members of the extended family will prefer to move out and others would stay. However, the overall decision to consider migration to a large extent can be based on a net present value from a cost-benefit analysis which the household and individual will do. And in that analysis, they will factor the cost of modification of their exposure and vulnerability levels. So if it costs more to maintain the current structure, perhaps it makes more economic sense to go outside elsewhere and build a newly or a strong settlement where your house and your family can be protected. So I would say that this research is important to inform our cabinet ministers, especially when it comes to climate change policy formulation and implementation process. There are certain major development initiatives. We have a report that was published or a study that was funded by the European Union and the Gambia government, and the recommendations in that study clearly stated that the government should refrain from building major infrastructures in Banjul. What does that mean? For example, our National Assembly shouldn't have been built on a wetland, in my opinion, because that is an infrastructure that will have a long lifespan. And based on the scientific predictions or the scientific knowledge that we know, it is likely that that infrastructure will be collapsed there at a time when the city is vulnerable, so vulnerable that we cannot protect it. So policy formulation and implementation it would be important for them to be informed by scientific research or research that can help in their decision-making process. I think this research will also contribute to our understanding of the connection or the nexus between migration and climate change, because this is an emerging area. There has been migration studies have been occurring for decades, but looking at the vulnerability nature of communities today, sort of linking migration to climate change is an emerging area of scholarship. So the recommendations that I have is, number one, I think the Gambia government should venture into what I call a national consultation to engage stakeholders in identifying a strategic location and start mobilizing resources for building our next capital city. As a developing and a poor economy, I don't think that we can just wake up overnight and build a new city. Other countries in Africa have built or have moved into a new capital city. Why not the Gambia? So therefore, I think we can do that. I also think that we need to revise our newly adopted climate change policy. In the climate change policy I read, looking at the various adaptation strategies the Gambia government has laid out, migration is not even mentioned. Not even the word migration has been mentioned in that policy document. And I think it is important that we recognize that this is not forced migration, but this is more of what we call voluntary migration based on an anticipatory risk that communities or households are perceiving. So I think we need to revise our climate change policy and sort of incorporate this idea of migration as a form of adaptation to climate change. In the short and medium term, I think we would have to invest in soft and hard engineering solutions. We have to some extent, build some revetments and seawalls and all of that kind of stuff to protect the island, at least for the next couple of decades, maybe until 2050. I think we will still be inhabiting this area for the next couple of decades. So it makes sense for us to still protect it. I also want to applaud the work of the City Council, which is Banjul City Council, for the newly launched project that they have just started. I guess the work will start pretty soon. The project will really restructure or rehabilitate the grey water infrastructure of the city. I think that is essential for mitigating flood risk in the city. As you know, Banjul becomes a hotspot is a flood hotspot. It's a disaster-prone area when it comes to flooding, and this affects people in all spheres of life. People, commuters, and students, and mentally challenged individuals. It affects all kinds of people. So I think it's important that we are still investing in rebuilding or rehabilitating the grey water infrastructure of the city. In conclusion, I I would strongly say that I think about 50% of Banjulians still love Banjul, and they love Banjul. There's no way to doubt that. Studies have shown that people love where they come from. I spoke to a lady while I was going to the Gambia in the flight, in the plane, and then the lady told me that she is from Banjul, but she is not currently residing in the city. I asked where she was, and she told me she lives elsewhere outside of Banjul. So she built a new house where she is living. And I asked her whether she would consider or vote for any proposal for the Gambia to build a second capital city. And then her response was, nope, we need Banjul. Banjul is our city. And I think there is still that emotional or psychological attachment to place that the Banjulians have for Banjul. Just like any human being, wherever we all come from, we love our place. So I do think that they will prefer to stay in the medium term if their protection measures have and the living condition of the city improves. I think that will mitigate or that will minimize and slow down the rate of migration that has been occurring over decades, right? However, I do believe that the island will not survive the end of this century because of sea level rise threats. Remember, even if we stop all emissions today, the climate change impacts on sea level rise will still be there. So global mean sea level will continue to rise for a couple of decades because we've already caused enough harm. So I do think that what we call voluntary migration, or sort of migration as a risk reduction strategy, is a smart idea, or is a smart adaptation move that Banjulians could utilize, and as well as the government can think about in terms of even decentralizing government institutions, because we have to understand that decentralization is even part of our national policies. So instead of building new institutions in Banjul, it makes more sense to have a strategic location identified and start building those new institutions so that over time it becomes easy to move. So I will conclude here, and I will thank you very much for your time. And I also say that this is just a synopsis of the whole paper that I wrote. This is just a chapter of my dissertation. So there is a lot to talk about, but I wouldn't bore you with all of that information. And you can look out for that paper once it is published. So I thank you very much for your kind attention once again. Bye-bye.